Hey, it's Nikki, and today's episode is a special series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact with my friends from Borshoff. I am a huge fan of the work Borshoff does to advance internal communication, and so happy that they have joined Gut Plus Science for a special series. Get ready for internal communication inspiration. There's so many nuggets of wisdom here.
Hey, it's Katherine Coble, your host for a very special Gut Plus Science series called In the Loop, Communicating for Maximum Leadership Impact. Our big goal is to help leaders become better communicators because communication is your best tool for leading well. Let's go ahead and dive into this month's topic. Well, we're back in the studio today, and we have a very special guest with me, Dr. Michael Kirchhoff, who is with Cooper Health. Super excited to have you today, and I want to give you an opportunity to give us a little bit of your background. But first, I just want to say welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. Yeah, I'm Mike Kirchhoff, an emergency physician. I've been at Cooper University Healthcare now for over a quarter century. I've had many hats. My primary role has been as an emergency physician. I'm an attending physician there. Did med school and residency there, and then had various clinical leadership and administrative roles there. The two hats I wear now that get me in the most trouble are patient safety officer, chief innovation officer. You might ask yourself, that's odd, patient safety and innovation, but we're very intentional in our organization. We have clinical leaders throughout the organization, including one of our co-CEOs. And on the clinical side, we're very intentional about taking what we're learning with patient care and helping that inform our leadership styles and how and what we need to communicate. So, for example, as a patient safety officer, I identify potential barriers to care and how we can remove those barriers so our team members can take the best care of patients and our communities. And when we identify those barriers, we then bring technology to bear to remove those barriers and make the good easy and the bad hard. So it gives us an opportunity to not only learn as an organization, but then create value for our team members and our communities and healthcare at large by then publicizing what we're doing or do tech transfer around the new technologies or applications that we're developing to provide better patient care. And that just makes everybody happier and brings about great change.
Sounds great. So tell us a little bit about the kinds of teams that you typically work with. You probably have a very diverse group of employees who are under your leadership that you're collaborating with, probably some cross-functional work going on. So what's the span of your leadership there at Cooper Health?
On the patient safety side, I deal with the entire organization. And I think many of your listeners will agree, no matter what industry you're in, large organizations can be difficult to navigate, both in terms of understanding them, but also communicating within them. So one of the things that we really pay attention to is what's our audience. And in healthcare, we have everywhere from entry-level unskilled positions all the way up to very advanced skilled positions. And those individuals, they consume their information differently at different levels of the organization. So we're very intentional about when we're communicating, understanding these teams, and then making sure that our communication style meets the needs of those teams. We want to meet the team member where they're at, right? I've heard many a leader say, well, I sent an email and they still don't know what happened or what I wanted or, what it was. And the thing is, the first time you ask that, I can understand that. But the second time you ask that, the question should be then, leader, why are you still sending emails? So understanding the organization, understanding the different teams at the different levels of the organization and the different verticals within the organization is very important. And then it informs our communication style and the technologies that we use. One of my mantras, when people say over communicate, my mantra is communicate multiple times in every channel every time until people just don't want to hear it anymore, right? Over communicating is not just sending a second email. It's understanding that team members want to consume this mission critical information in different ways. And if I'm an environmental services worker who doesn't really engage with email, how do I communicate with that individual as opposed to a provider who is every other minute in their email and in direct communication with their one-up supervisor about understanding what are the needs of the organization? Those two individuals are both valuable to the organization. And I have to make sure that when we have a critical message that we understand those different teams and understand what it is that they're looking for from a communication and how they prefer to ingest that information so that it's available to them, and then keep sending it to them in all these different vehicles many, many different times. It's I can't say it enough. And I hear leaders all the time saying, well, just over communicate. But to them, that's just sending more emails. And that works for some folks, but for others, it may not. And understanding your organization is so, so important. One of the things that is of paramount importance there is also understanding about sort of every level of that organization, understanding not only the channel that they want, but the level of education, using the right terminology so people understand that. So that may mean that that message changes for one group than the other, both in terms of their level of having to understand the process or their role in implementing the change, et cetera. Those things all become very, very important.
Right. And I would think, especially in, again, a healthcare setting, we're often talking about life and death and people needing to be very focused on the things that are in front of them, the patients that are in front of them, and giving them information once or twice or even three times is great, but they may just be completely inundated with something else that is so much more important in the moment that they can't even begin to digest what you're asking them to do or to understand.
That's very true. It brings up two really important points that I just want to we can come back to if we want to, because they're super important. One is healthcare, like many large organizations, are complex organizations. And the definition of a complex organization means that you have one or more units that are independent, that are making independent decisions from each other. So what that means is you have to think about the change you're communicating, but also understanding how those different independent units will respond to that change, because they're making independent decisions based on the data that you're sending them. And because they're making independent decisions, those independent decisions can interact in very unique ways that can bring uncertainty to the communication or uncertainty to the clinical workflow or the business case that you're trying to make. So understanding that people are independent actors in different verticals within your organization and that they can make independent decisions, your communication needs to think about that and make sure that you're addressing that. And that's another point that leaders miss all the time, that really not understanding that things may go wrong because somebody's interpreted your message differently, or you didn't change your message to meet their needs, and then they don't understand the ask, and then they make a decision independent from another group that then ultimately interacts when the patient moves from vertical to vertical within the organization, or if you're not doing healthcare, when your product moves from, or the customer moves from vertical to vertical. Understanding that these different verticals are making independent decisions that may adversely affect your product, your patient, your customer as they move from different verticals within your organization is really important to understand. And most leaders really don't understand complexity in complex organizations, and understanding the implications of these valuable assets, be it your patient, be it your product, or be it your customer, moving from unit to unit to unit. Because they're making independent decisions, you have to be very intentional about how you communicate so that there's no ambiguity, so that those independent decisions are all rowing in the same direction, so that you don't have conflict when your valuable resource moves from vertical to vertical within your organization.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I'm curious, before we get into broader issues in the healthcare space or at Cooper Health or anywhere else, I'm just curious about you as a leader. What would you say is your personal communication style?
I talk fast and can be very bombastic from time to time. I get very excited about what I do, but the beauty is having a great team. So, when I first started as a leader, I used to sort of roll my eyes a little bit at some of these team dynamic tests, et cetera, your leadership styles, et cetera. And the first mark of a great leader is understanding your limitations. The second mark of a great leader is understanding how you communicate so that you can adjust that for the right audience. But lastly, also, when you understand your limitations and how you communicate, then getting the other people in your editorial group to help you understand how to craft your message in a way that resonates with people who receive information or want to receive direction in a different way. So docs like me because I talk like a doctor and I'm very black and white and very fast and to the facts and move on. But that's not how everybody wants data. And this gets to this idea of editorializing or your editorial group. Editing is very, very important in the messaging. And when we talk a little bit more about story and this idea of iteration, editing becomes very important. And I don't mean editing as in, wordsmithing. I mean true editorial content. What's the audience? How do I change this for this audience? And is the style and tone right for that audience? And my style and tone isn't the same it shouldn't be the same for everybody in the organization. And when the style and tone that's being called for is not my forte, I rely on an editorial group and copywriters and other leaders to help convey that message because I know their style, their tone resonates better with the audience. And you have to have no ego and be able to let that messaging go for the folks that are right for the job. So when we're having these conversations, when we're talking about my style is I try to have a couple different styles, but in the end, I talk fast and want people to understand facts, and that doesn't always work. So I have a really great editorial group. I have a really great internal communications group. They have copywriters that help me. Now, not every organization has that, but understanding that your style and tone and what you're trying to convey is very audience dependent. And if you're not paying homage to that, your message is going to be lost for certain segments of your audience. And you don't need copywriters for that. You can use ChatGPT. You can set tone. Ask somebody who does that work. One of the things we talk about in patient safety all the time is deference to expertise. That expertise is the people doing the work. If I don't know how an environmental services worker wants to ingest information, I go to an environmental services worker. What do you do? How do you check in? What's important to you? Then I go to their supervisors. I go to HR. What's the educational level of this group of folks? How do I write that copy? What words do I use? How do I editorialize that in a way that resonates with that group? And that's a lot of work. And I think what we're going to find as we talk is communication is really, really hard. And when you think it's easy, you're doing it all wrong. If you're already talking about looking at the educational level of your audience and talking to different folks and having an editorial board that's like looking at your talking points and editing them for you and giving you 5 different messages for a mission critical item, yeah, that's communication. If you're not doing that, you're doing it wrong. And everybody wants to write a couple words, an email, send it off, and think it's going to work fine. And when you peel back the covers and understand in your organization, like we talked about in the beginning, these different groups and the different groups that you as leader touch, it's everywhere from entry-level high school grads all the way up to MD, PhDs working in their domain for 50 years. And that MD, PhD working in their domain for 50 years might only know email. The next MD, PhD that's been working for 2 years wants to ingest it in social media, right? So even from an educational level, those channels and editorializing and knowing your audience becomes super, super important.
I think also something you bring up that leaders should always keep in mind too is that communication really is a team sport. It's not up to just you as the leader to do all of the communicating. Clearly, employees are going to look to you for the vision and for the highest level, like where are we going and what are we supposed to be doing? But your supervisors or your leadership team, as part of that, is they need to understand and be aware of your communication style and where your gaps are. And not that that's a bad thing, it's just we're all different, and help you fill in those gaps. If you're the fast talker and you stay at the 30,000 foot level, then their role is to come in behind you with that next level of detail and that next level of personalization for their teams. And when everybody's firing on all cylinders and everyone's playing the right role and you're all aligned, those communications are going to kind of be like that waterfall, and it's going to really start to make sense to employees.
Yeah, you have to let go sometimes. But it also speaks to how much effort you are putting into crafting your message. If you have a communication imperative, it's one thing to state that imperative, but that might work for 80%, but the edge cases become very foggy. And we've just established you can't communicate to all team members all the time. You're going to rely on managers and team members to ingest that data removed from you. So if you're not very careful as a leader about how you're setting out that message in the beginning, when the next leader or team member takes that on and shares that with another team member or another leader, they're going to put their own spin on it. And if you're not careful on iterating your message and really understanding what you want and what you're asking for and what the potential edge cases or conflicts might be in the organization, then the next leader that picks it up is going to stumble on an edge case, not understand how to manage that, and they're going to send the wrong message.
Yeah. So to that point, I think in an earlier conversation that you and I had, we talked a little bit about this idea of storytelling and how that's very helpful to making a connection with employees so they really are understanding the vision and where we're going and that sort of thing. You said something pretty provocative to me when we had that conversation. And you basically said everything that leaders know about storytelling is wrong. That was one of the things, one of two things. Tell us a little bit more about what you think is so wrong about what leaders think about storytelling.
Yeah, now not every leader's wrong. I'm some really good at it, but I've had the benefit of working with other organizations and seeing some bad efforts in that space. And it really got me thinking about how do I teach the next generation of leaders within our organization how to be good at this. And I started like everybody else started. You go to the internet, right? And type storytelling. And you get lots of great stuff, beginning, middle, and end, tension and release, right? This idea of the story arc. And it's all very beautiful and all very important. But the first order leader is just not even going to think about storytelling. They're going to put a couple bullet points in and they're going to send it and be surprised it doesn't resonate with folks. So that's the first mistake. Then you get sort of that next level leader who's engaged, wants to learn, wants to be better. And they've heard this thing about story and storytelling. And they might try it, but storytelling, I mean, just ask any screenwriter, ask any novelist, right? You don't sit down and write a story and you're done with it, right? There's a degree of iteration. And what leaders get wrong about storytelling is not the narrative arc. It's the work that goes behind that narrative arc so that narrative arc makes sense in different contexts. So we already spent a lot of time talking about complex organizations, spent a lot of time talking about different levels of your organization and how these different verticals interact, et cetera, right? So it's really complicated. And because it's complicated, your message has to be robust to meet any perturbations it might have in each of these different venues. And by just writing something down doesn't really get you thinking about this. So the way I like to think about it, I have sort of two mental models that I use for this. One is on the innovation side, this idea of deploy, experiment, and iterate. This idea that, okay, I have an idea and I'm going to get it down on paper, and then I'm going to try it different ways, and it's going to inform a new way of doing it. And then I'm going to deploy that version. So this idea of what people are getting wrong about storytelling is this idea that it's never right the first time. You're always going to edit. You're always going to change your story. And there's this iterative process that people get wrong about storytelling because it's not concise. It hasn't thought about edge cases. It hasn't thought about, okay, this might work for me in my vertical, but it might be different for somebody else in the organization in a different vertical or in a different circumstance. So story is about not only the narrative arc, but this process. And the other way I like to think about it, besides deploy, experiment, and iterate, is start with your communication imperative. What are those things, right? And most leaders are very good at that. They're going to give you a set of bullet points about what it is they want to communicate, what needs to get done. And that's a great starting point. But leaders get that wrong by just deploying that. So what they need to do is then think about it and have another version of it. So typically in healthcare, it starts off as there's some mandate, either from a regulatory agency or a leader, and then it mandate sort of doesn't work and it fails, and then we create a policy. And so now that policy is very verbose. It's hard to find what I need in there. It's not very portable. I can't, as an employee, readily access it. I certainly can't access it in my brain. So if it can't be knowledge in the head, it's got to be knowledge in the world. If it's knowledge in the world, I have to be able to access that easily. If I can't find that easily, even if I can find it, policies tend to be very verbose, have a lot of information in it. And then even those aren't well done because they don't take into account edge cases and failure modes, et cetera. So now the next version is, versions 2 and 3 of the policy, which are even bigger because now people are thinking about edge cases, et cetera. But in the end, even if you create a narrative arc and story around that, it's just unwieldy. Nobody's going to remember 14 pages of policy if they can even find it. So now you need to edit. So we haven't even, right now we're just getting to editing, right? And we're not even done with the final story yet. And now I have to edit that into the essence of what's going on. Now I understand edge cases. Now I understand how it fails. Now I understand how this mandate works within the organization, within my vertical, within other verticals, across verticals. And I start distilling that down into basic principles about what it is that I need a team member to do to meet this requirement. And that's where story starts. Now I can have a nice narrative arc about an example that really helps people understand the essence of what I need them to get at. Because the beauty of that is when I give you the essence, when I have a really good narrative about the action or the change that I'm asking for, that narrative not only encodes what it is that I need them to do, but it encodes the intent so that when team members hit edge cases, they get the intent and it makes them much more likely to be prepared to meet an edge case appropriately. If I just give them a bullet point, if I just give them a 14-page policy, they still don't understand what do I do when something's a little not quite right. And that's where story starts. And I think that's a recurring theme here. There's a lot of work at the beginning and everybody just wants it to be done. Story is no different. There's all this work of deploying, experimenting, iterating, of having that big funnel and bringing it down to a distilled nugget of truth that really helps you explain what it is. And then one of the best ways to explain that nugget of truth is through story, through a narrative that gives you an example, a real life example with real life people, with real life consequences. And that makes it meaningful and impactful in a way. That's why people go for story, because that narrative becomes really important. It's easier to remember. Now it's knowledge in my head, much easier to recall than me requiring them to have knowledge in the world and going out to that policy and pulling it in. They're never going to do that if they're busy. I need to create a narrative that's easy for them to remember. So it's knowledge in the head for quick recall that encodes everything that I'm asking them to do, including edge cases. And that's really, really hard to do. And that's story.
So I just want to clarify one thing you just mentioned, and you've mentioned several times, the idea of edge cases. And I'm assuming by that you're really just generally speaking about those kind of the anomalies, the things that fall outside of the norm. But in healthcare, I'm guessing there's quite a few edge cases. So how do you account for that when you're trying to come up with examples and shortened, streamlined ways of communicating to people about something that could be quite complex? How do you do that? Where do you even start?
It's really complex. You ready?
Yeah.
Talk to people.
Oh, talk to people. Tell me more.
Yes. Yeah. So, and I think that's the other thing I had said to you that, nobody likes to have a conversation, right? Everybody wants to have, this is what I need you to do. We're not talking, just go do it. And okay, that works sometimes. But one, it doesn't engender engagement, and a disengaged workforce is just dangerous. It doesn't make you a great leader. And you might get people to do that one thing, but they're not going to understand what to do when there's an anomaly, when it's doesn't quite fit into the narrative that you've set forth. So how do you account for that? How do you think about how do you experiment and iterate? It's by talking with people, having conversations, going to talk to the doctor, right? I much rather talk to an EVS worker or a transporter than a doctor, just because doctors are hard to talk to and they're hard to convince of things, but you need to talk to everybody. And by having a conversation, you're probing where the edge of their knowledge is, you're probing where the edge of their resources are, and then you can have a better idea of, okay, this story works for this group but not this group. How do I get it to work for both? And the only way you're going to get that is to have conversation. not dictate, not mandate, but conversation, and have a genuine interest in what those team members are saying and meeting them where they're at. I've had in many other organizations that I've worked with, like, well, I sent them the email. Why don't they? Well, we talked about that already. Why didn't they read it? Well, because that's not how they consume their information. So you would know that if you went and talked to that group and understood. And then when they tell you they don't read email, don't go, but we give you an email address, read your email, right? That's what a lot of leaders do. That's the other thing they get wrong. They're like, okay, well, I want you to fit into the mold, my mental model that I have for you as a team member, as an employee. We've mandated you need to read email, read your email. Okay, that's great. You can mandate it. But if people don't read email, they're not going to read email. You can't re-engineer the human. You can't re-engineer what's incentivizing them. You have to align their incentives and meet them where they're at. And if they don't read email, don't tell them to read email. Ask them then, how do you want the information, right? Do they want it on a bulletin board? Do they want to lunch and learn? Do they want to watch a video? Do they want their leader to share it with them on the huddle? Create those channels that meet that need, but you only know about those channels if you have a conversation. You need to go talk. And part of that is, and I kind of get myself into a little bit of trouble in that we talk about rounding, and there's kind of two ways of rounding, and they're not mutually exclusive. We are a student organization. We have very specific rounding requirements, and that's great. And it works really well, but it's very scripted. So it meets an engagement and a leadership goal, but it doesn't necessarily meet a communication goal. That's a little bit more by managing by walking around. And a lot of leaders don't like that, right? And it's not a best practice if you as a leader, the only way you're going to manage and round is managing by walking around, right? You have to be intentional sometimes about how you round and the goals you're trying to achieve with that rounding and meeting and talking with team members. But another goal, which is different from, let's say, environment of care roundings, which is something we do looking at how we caring for patients, et cetera, or a leader might do in terms of like other engagement dimensions that they're trying to probe, right? But if you want to ask them, how do you want to be communicated to? That's a different type of rounding, and having a conversation and really just talking, that has value as well. Just realize that there's a time and place for that. So managing by walking around, managing by having a conversation, managing by just engaging in small talk, and then having a conversation about what it is that you as a team member need, not what I as a leader want. It's what does the team member need? How do they want to get that? And the thing people get wrong is not honoring that. We see that in healthcare all the time. As a clinician seeing patients, we tell our clinicians all the time, meet the patient where they're at. If they're not ready to stop smoking, don't belittle them about their smoking. Talk, educate them, but then do something else. If they're not taking their medications, don't be like, next time take your medication. Why aren't you taking your medications? It makes me feel poorly. I can't afford it. Whatever those barriers are, probe and understand what those barriers are. And it's the same for communicating. If I don't understand where you're coming from, I can't just tell you to do a thing. One of the things I joke about all the time and on the patient safety side is when we have a near miss and we have identified where a process needs to be improved, one of the first things leaders like to say, not so much at our organization, because as a high reliability organization and sort of safety focused, we sort of overcome this a bit, but I still see it in a lot of healthcare organizations, and I see it at a ton of other organizations, is the easy thing is to educate, to write a policy, et cetera. So basically you're telling that human, if you didn't ingest the message correctly, just ingest it better next time. Well, it didn't work the first time. Why would it work the second time? So stop trying to re-engineer the human, re-engineer the process. If we are finding barriers to care, don't tell the human who is delivering the care to work better. Create a system around that human to better deliver that care, and you'll have better outcomes. And the same is true for communication. Saying, well, read your email is the same thing as me saying, take your medicine, right? The patient's not going to take their medicine if there's a barrier. Someone's not going to read their email if there's a barrier. So understanding what those barriers are and then re-engineering the process around that care delivery or that process around that message delivery, that's how you effectively communicate. And that's hard work, and nobody wants to do that. So leaders just say, read your email next time, and it just won't work.
So well said. Thank you so much, Dr. Kirchhoff. It's been really fun talking to you. And I think that you have really uncovered some things that really are universal beyond just the healthcare industry. Focus on the people, the focus on the iteration, the focus on the idea that you do have to repeat things. And it's not because people don't want to hear, it's just that they may have a lot of other things going on. They may be processing it differently. And all of those things are just so important. So thank you so much for sharing some of your insights with us. Wish you all the best of luck with everything that you're doing at Cooper Health, patient safety, patient innovation. It's all so important to our healthcare system and what you're doing in that part of the country. And we just wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And I hope I can help your listeners just communicate a little bit better for better outcomes.
What a great conversation today with Dr. Michael Kirchhoff. You know, I heard a couple of key things that I think will help any leader in any type of organization. The first is that large organizations can be very complex. This means we have to spend extra time really understanding our audiences. Who are our employees? Where are they? How do they consume information? How can we truly reach them? And we can't be afraid to communicate constantly and to over-communicate. And over-communicating doesn't mean just repeating the same thing over and over again. It also means using every channel we have available and understanding if those channels are working for those employees. My second big takeaway today is that communication is hard. If you think it's easy, you're probably doing it wrong. Now, I think what he meant by that is you just have to really understand that it's important to be intentional, to be constantly iterating on your message, and to be sure that you are editing and adjusting as you learn more from the audiences that you're speaking to. When you can do this, you'll be a much more effective leader and a much more effective communicator. The secret weapon in all communications truly is talking to people. When you have two-way conversations, your communication will be much more effective. It's really the heart of what it's all about. Thanks for listening.
We just left the world a little bit better. Now, go do something with it.